Christians generally are just unaware of what's available to them in the Book of Mormon.
Can we talk about this? Because a lot of people don't know about this theory that there were actually two different sets of plates.
Just, you can do that with all of the commandments, the law of chastity, the word of wisdom, and you can find that rational reason to live that, and it's logically going to be better in the end for you.
David Whitmer said, "Do you want to ride to Fayette?" And the guy says, "No, I'm going to Cumorah." And David Whitmer, in his account of this, said, "I didn't know what Cumorah meant." Of course, he hadn't read the Book of Mormon, right? He turned to Joseph and said, "Who was this guy?" And Joseph said it was one of the three Nephites, and he had the plates.
I wasn't planning on asking this question or going down this route. You brought up this point that there are other factions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They believe in the Book of Mormon, but there's differences. Why is it that you choose the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints over the Community of Christ Church or these other factions? What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode on the Stick of Joseph YouTube channel.
First and foremost, we want to say a huge thank you to everyone that made it out to our fireside this last Sunday. We had over 150 people show up, which is about 149 more people than we were expecting.
And we were expecting the one to be our mom. So
Dude, we even had, if you see D-Cart in the comments, he drove up from Las Vegas.
So it was awesome meeting you guys. It was cool because it wasn't a steak event, so everybody there knew the Stick of Joseph, which was fun to talk with you, learn about you. And so we're going to be holding some more of those in the future. And we just have to give a shout out to Whitaker. Whitaker, you know who you are.
Yeah, we had a young boy come up to us, brings us to the side. He's like, "Hey, my dad watches all your videos, and could you just say my name in one?"
So Whitaker, this is for you, bro. All right, so today we have Jonathan Neville on, and this is one of his books, The Rational Restoration. There is also another book called By Means of the Urim and Thummim that you guys may be familiar with. All of his books are available on Digital Legends website, link in the description. And if you use code The Stick of Joseph, you get 15% off. We talk about this book, By Means of the Urim and Thummim, and, you know, all things Jonathan Neville. So if you want to dive into these subjects more, we highly recommend you dive into his books. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Stick of Joseph. We have with us Jonathan Neville. By popular demand, we brought him on for a second time. So
I don't know. We lost a lot of subscribers after his last episode.
But we recovered.
Yeah, that was tough.
We gained him back after he created a bunch of fake accounts and subscribed again.
There you go.
No, we love Jonathan, and if you haven't listened to that interview, you can go back and listen to it. But one thing we're going to start off with today is we actually have a Patreon subscriber, one of you guys, one of you viewers, well, actually he's right here, who is in our Discord, and when we asked our Discord who do they want on, he was like, "I want Jonathan Neville." Well, little did he know we already had a date planned with Jonathan Neville, and so we were like, "Hey, why don't you come out and ask Jonathan Neville a question yourself?" And so you're not going to see him on camera, but welcome to Ben. And Ben, what is the question you want to ask Jonathan Neville to start off today's episode?
So I just finished reading By Means of the Urim and Thummim. Anybody that'll listen long enough for me to tell it to them, they'll get an earful of what I've learned. I've had a couple of people push back a little bit and be like, "Oh, but I actually heard this thing from this church historian, whatever it is, like the last testimony of Sister Emma." And I'm like, "Oh, well, actually, there's a good reason why we can interpret that a better way and try and present the things." But I find I have a problem with coming off a little bit too hard. I was wondering if, with your emphasis on no contention, if you might have some ideas of how best to share these ideas without making it sound like I'm attacking anybody.
That's a fantastic question.
Good
Great way
question.
to start off.
Heck yeah, Ben. I'm glad we had you out here.
Yeah, that was really well done. Well, to start off with, the last testimony of Emma, Sister Emma, was an interview that she had with her son, Joseph Smith III.
Mm-hmm. And he was a leader at the time of the RLDS.
The RLDS Church. And he did this interview shortly before she died. And he wrote down the questions before he went to see her, and then he wrote down her answers. And I have an original copy of that those
Really?
notes that he
Cool.
took. And so, well, a copy of the original.
A copy of the original, yeah.
And so, but he didn't publish it until about 6 months after she died. And she never publicly acknowledged it. But we just assumed that that's what she actually said.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one of the issues that that I have with it. People quote it all the time, as you know, in the Gospel Topics essays and so on. Joseph Smith III himself, a few years after this, wrote an article about the translation of the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
And he was responding to David Whitmer's stuff about the stone and the hat. And he never once mentioned that interview with his mother. It's like he never talked about it after he did the interview. It's like he did the interview, here's what she said, but it didn't have any credibility to him because he concluded that Joseph Smith used the Urim and Thummim to translate the Book of Mormon.
Interesting. So he had, just to clarify, he had the interview with Emma.
Yeah, he did the interview with
and then
Emma.
after he wrote this article that said, and he never mentioned that
never
she
mentioned
said that he used the Seer son.
He never did. And so when you have someone who conducted the interview with his own mother and then later wrote a whole long article about the translation and concluded that David Whitmer was wrong, he didn't use a stone in the hat, that he used the Urim and Thummim to translate, when he didn't even mention the interview with his mother, that tells me that interview didn't have a lot of credibility for him.
Interesting.
And the other thing about that, when you read that interview, the first question he asked was, is it true that Sidney Rigdon married you and my father? And you know what that was for? Why he asked that question?
To see if she was there. And
well, partly that, but it was because the people that were promoting the Spalding theory, they said that Sidney Rigdon knew Joseph Smith long before. And so there was a rumor that Sidney Rigdon was the minister that married Joseph and Emma.
Interesting.
And that's why, so the whole interview started off as to refute the Solomon Spalding theory. And, of course, she denied it. She said, we'd never met Sidney Rigdon, but that's how it started off. And that's why we propose in this book that whole interview was intended to refute the Solomon Spalding theory. You know how a lot of people, we've talked about this before, about how the Book of Mormon is real complex and Joseph couldn't have written it.
Yeah.
That's why the Spalding theory was so popular in the 1800s, because the idea was there was a curtain between him and his scribe, and he was just sitting behind the curtain reading this manuscript by Solomon Spalding, who had taken years to write it and so forth. And that was really the predominant theory among anti-Mormons or even non-Mormons at that time in the 1800s. And Joseph Smith III had been working to refute that theory all along. That's why he started off this interview with his mother asking about that.
Okay.
And so what I interpret that interview as Emma trying to refute the Spalding theory, to say there's nothing between us. He had his head in the hat the whole time. He had no book to read from. But that was all based, in my view, on a demonstration that Joseph did in Fayette, which I think we've talked about before.
Yeah.
But so to answer your question, I would say the first part is that Joseph Smith III, who conducted the interview, didn't even refer to it when he was talking about the translation. The second part is, when that interview was published, shortly afterwards, Orson Pratt in General Conference talked again about the translation with the Urim and Thummim. And I did an analysis of how many times the brethren talked about the Urim and Thummim in General Conference. And around the time that interview was published in the RLDS newspaper called the Saints Herald, they talked about it frequently in General Conference, that it was the Urim and Thummim that Joseph Smith used. So it wasn't like they were unaware of the interview.
Yeah.
And yet it got resurrected a few years ago among LDS scholars, and all of a sudden now it's the most authoritative
talked about
thing, and they don't even talk about what Joseph and Oliver said.
Yeah.
And so to me it's a perplexing thing, and there's no reason to have a contention over it. One of the things I talk about in this Rational Restoration book is the faith model, where everybody can agree to the facts, right?
Yeah.
Critics, supporters, believers, non-believers, we can all agree to the facts. And in this case, the fact is that Joseph Smith III recorded that interview that he had with his mother. Now, that doesn't mean the facts that she said are accurate.
But she said it. The fact is she said it.
Yeah,
right?
At least he recorded it. We can't even be sure she said it because we weren't there, but we can say that he wrote down those answers. And when you read that document, you can tell it's kind of a summary of a conversation.
Yeah.
It's not a verbatim. It looks like a question and answer, but anytime you have a conversation, you say more things than you would just summarize.
Yeah.
So, but we can all agree that that interview exists because it was published. We have the handwritten original of it. But then from there, we take our assumptions. One assumption someone might say is that, well, she was delusional or she was about to die, so maybe it wasn't credible. Another assumption you could say is that she was completely credible. She was right there and she told the exact facts, even though they happened decades earlier. Another assumption you could make is that she was trying to refute the Solomon Spalding theory. And so she was kind of extrapolating based on that demonstration. There's a wide range of assumptions you can make. But then there's a lot of inferences also. That's why it's the faith model: facts, assumptions, inferences, theories, and hypotheses. Because there's a lot of gaps in her testimony, too, that people have to make inferences on what she meant, where she was. She didn't even say where she was when she was acting as a scribe, or which parts of the Book of Mormon she wrote. So we have to make assumptions and inference all the way through. And depending on your assumptions and inferences, that leads to your theories and your hypotheses.
Yeah.
So there's no reason to contend about it. We just have to recognize if we separate facts from our assumptions, then we can see how we reach different conclusions.
Yeah, it's interesting because as we've started to embark upon all these different historical accounts and stuff, you can't just look and like, oh, Emma Smith said that, end of story. It's like you have to look at the context, who was there, at what time period, how many years after the fact, and that changes a lot. And so we love that you are such a knowledgeable man on these things, and you know, when we asked you what you would want to talk about today, you published a book recently called The Rational Restoration. And apparently, I mean, you're reframing, kind of putting things in context to like explain kind of the idea behind writing the Rational Restoration.
Yeah, good. Well, part of it was to establish this faith model, because it's always frustrating to me when I read either the detractors or the faithful scholars or ordinary members of the church that don't know that much about these things, and they mingle the facts with theories all the time. And it's hard to tease those apart. But having worked as a lawyer for so many years, I'm used to doing that, because when you're in court and you cross-examine someone, that's where you bring out the difference between the fact and assumptions. And so I'm hoping this idea of no more contention, the website I have on that, the idea there is to promote clarity, charity, and understanding. And the clarity part of it is separating facts from assumptions. You know, getting back to this last testimony of Sister Emma, the members of the church, and the leaders of the church at the time, particularly Orson Pratt and Brigham Young, they were contemporaries of Joseph Smith, and they knew what he taught. Yeah. And they didn't suddenly say, well, Emma said this, well, that must be the truth, instead of everything else I've taught.
Well, they had a contentious relationship with Emma to begin with.
That's true.
You know,
Brigham Young said she was the biggest damned liar he'd ever met, those kind of things.
Yeah. It was Brigham Young. Brigham Young didn't mince his words. He went hard.
And
no chill with Brigham Young.
The other thing about that last testimony is the last part of it was all about polygamy. And she denied that Joseph Smith had ever married another woman and so on. And when that was first published, that testimony was first published, it became a big deal in the Deseret News in Salt Lake. And you had several people say, I don't know what she's talking about, because I was present at some of these, and she was too. And some people suspected that maybe Joseph Smith III had written the whole thing, concocted it, hadn't even talked to his mother. So there's a lot of reasons to question the validity of that last testimony.
Interesting.
And yet it's quoted everywhere. Yeah. I see it on all these Come Follow Me podcasts. And apparently nobody knew that Joseph Smith III didn't even give it enough credibility to talk about it when he wrote an article about the translation. That's one of the things we discovered and put in this book.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's interesting to kind of go on to what Ben was saying a little bit more. Yeah. And this is what I want in the conversation, especially even with Book of Mormon geography and stuff, is let's agree on the facts. And that's like, let's just say, there are accounts that say he used a seer stone. Right. There are accounts that say he used a Urim and Thummim. For these reasons, I believe that he used both of them. For these reasons, I believed he just used the Urim and Thummim. Right. And let's just state our reasons without calling people liars, calling people stupid or anything like that. Even when it comes to Book of Mormon geography, there are these claims. Let's just lay out the facts. These are the assumptions I'm making. These are the assumptions you're making. Yeah. And let's just sit there, and we don't have to have the contention that Ben was talking about earlier.
And the other thing I pointed out in here is that a lot of contention is based on this compulsion to have other people agree with us. Yes. And to me, that comes from insecurity. You know, if I'm not too sure about my beliefs, I want you to believe the same thing I do, so then I know
because it affirms my beliefs.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And that's the opposite of what we should be doing. Yeah. We should be seeking understanding. That's the third part. So let me review those. So it's clarity, just getting facts separate from those. Charity means giving everybody the benefit of the doubt, right? we don't have any reason to contend with one another on a personal level at all. And someone who disagrees with us may have perfectly good intentions, and they may just see it differently. That's fine. So we have charity in that sense. But the third part is understanding, and I think that's maybe the most important, because rather than feeling like we have to convince or convert or persuade someone, we just want to understand where they're coming from. I talk a lot about multiple working hypotheses, right?
Yeah.
And that's a phrase that's making its way around. But it's because I feel like until we get additional information from the Lord, then we have what we have, and we can have multiple working hypotheses. And I call them working hypotheses because they're tentative.
All of them are incomplete to some degree.
That's right. And they're subject to additional information and analysis and all that. But they're working because they can build faith. Some people have faith in the Book of Mormon related to the Mesoamerican theory. That's fine with me.
Yeah.
Personally, I've felt that way for decades.
Yeah.
So I empathize with that idea. But at the time, I felt like I was ignorant. I didn't know about some of the things that the church leaders had taught in church history and about the extrinsic evidence. So once I learned those things, then my testimony became stronger and more unified, I would say. But it doesn't mean that when I was a missionary in France, I don't know if I've told you guys this, I used to do firesides on Mesoamerica on my mission.
Oh, no way.
Yes.
That's awesome.
I bought a French book at a bookstore called Maya, and it had all the temples, and I would show people, see, this is Book of Mormon stuff.
Was that the Maya? Was it what's his name? Who was the scholar, like the big scholar that did
Sorensen?
the Maya? Not Sorensen. No,
it wasn't an LDS book.
Yeah, it's
all it said, it didn't even have an author on the cover,
okay,
but
cool.
it just
It was
said
just
Maya.
pictures
I
of
still
Maya.
have that book.
Yeah.
I should have I'll bring it sometime.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
And I did a fireside, we promoted it, had people come, and afterwards I had one French guy come up to me and say, you don't really know much about Mayans, do you? And I said, what do you mean? He says, there's nothing about Christianity in Mayan culture. So that Book of Mormon couldn't be in Mesoamerica. And I was thinking, he just doesn't know the truth, But afterwards, I realized, in retrospect, he was right.
You feel that way,
So, but it took me decades to learn that. But I was a real, what would you say, aggressive missionary promoting Mesoamerican stuff. Because I didn't know any better. And yet, a lot of people had faith in that, and that's fine as long as it leads them to Christ. They can have maybe just like. A lot of Christians have beliefs about the Bible that we would consider not true or not accurate, but it still leads them to Christ. And that's the same way I feel about the Mesoamerican stuff. There's a lot of people whose testimonies originated there. Same with people in South America, And that's fine because it brings them to Christ, but they're always subject to further light and knowledge, and that's what I think leads them to understand the teachings of the prophets about Gomorrah and all the rest.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Not that we're going to focus on this for this episode, but I just, talking about we can agree on the facts, it's just so interesting to me that there's this qualm in between these two camps of thinking when the fact is Joseph Smith only advocated for one way.
Yeah,
right?
I understand
the
that
use
side.
of the Urim and Thummim.
The Urim and Thummim.
Urim and Thummim.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I thought you were talking about
and the heartland. That's lit. We won't get into that, or else we'll never get to what
it's true. Right. I think that's a really good point, and it's obvious that with your story about your mission that you've always been trying to find a rationale for your faith.
Exactly.
And that's something that's really important to you. And there is, I want to hear about the chapter 10 in your book, The Rational Restoration. What is the rationale for having new scripture? Because a lot of people, a lot of you that watch and are in the comments will say that you have to be brainwashed, you have to be stupid, that it's completely irrational to think that the Book of Mormon is actually a historical ancient scripture, right? Let's go through chapter 10 of that and talk about the Book of Mormon and the rationality for it.
Let me just explain how this is set up. So
cool.
The subtitle here is Reframes in the Pursuit of Clarity, Charity, and Understanding. And the idea is to take the same facts that everybody's been looking at all along, but then to reframe them a different way, get a different perspective on them.
Okay.
And so when I talk about the scriptures in here, particularly in chapter 10, I'd have to look at it to see which particular reframe I was talking about. But like the first one was reframing Moroni 10, for example. And a lot of times in the church we say the way you get a testimony of the Book of Mormon is by a spiritual prompting, right?
Just your feelings.
Your feelings.
Your feeling mostly.
And you read Moroni 10, and it does say, by the power of the Holy Ghost, you can know the truth of all things. But then in the next verses, people have overlooked this. It's amazing.
Yeah, let's
verses
open it up.
after that. Yeah, open it up.
Okay.
The next verses, he describes all the different ways that the Spirit works with us.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those things is you have a gift of great faith. And that's one we talk about the most when we talk about have a feeling of, the Holy Ghost speaks to our heart.
Yeah.
But there's also a gift of great knowledge and of learning. There's other ways that the Spirit works with us. And I use the example of Brigham Young himself. How long did it take him before he joined the church? Do you remember?
I don't remember. A long
like
time
3
now.
years.
3 years. Okay.
He had the Book of Mormon. He read it. He studied it. He pondered it. He worked on it. So he didn't have that instant spiritual conversion. It took him several years. And others were similar to that in church history, as well as today. We have a guy in our ward that was baptized after studying the gospel for about 17 years, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
His wife joined the church. He didn't.
Yeah.
And after she passed away, he met with the missionaries for 3 or 4 years, and he studied it in depth. He read Fawn Brody's book. He read everything, and he finally concluded at the end of that, this is true. And so then he got baptized, and that had just accelerated his spiritual growth, getting baptized. And then he went to the temple, and now he's super devout and everything. But it wasn't just, I read the Book of Mormon, had a spiritual prompting, so it's true. For some people that works. And Moroni calls it a gift of great faith.
Mm-hmm.
But there's all these other ways that people can have the Holy Ghost tell them what is true. And so for me, I definitely had the spiritual prompting, when I was 9 years old when I got baptized. But it's been an ongoing process of continuing to learn and to study these things out in my mind that have led me to where I am today.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we talked about this before, but I grew up in kind of a mixed family where my parents were divorced, and I had two different families that I lived in. One was LDS and one was not LDS.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
And my stepbrother and the non-LDS family was actually he wasn't a minister, but he was in this campus crusade for Christ that would go around to high schools and tell how stupid Mormons were, and and when I was on my mission, he would address the letters to me, younger Neville instead of elder Neville, this kind of stuff. So we had all kinds of debates, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't just say, well, I know it's true. I had to really study it out, and learn it, and that's why I went down the geography path even in high school,
Mm-hmm.
But when I read Moroni 10, that's one of the reframes in here is, let's don't tell people if they read it they'll get a testimony, because that's only for some people that have that gift of great faith.
Yeah.
Other people need to study and learn what are the supporting evidences. How does it fit with the Bible?
For sure.
In fact, I told you guys a minute ago, I'll just show this book real quick.
Yeah.
There's this new book out called Two Testaments, and it shows how the New Testament and the Book of Mormon teach the exact same thing all the way through, and it's a fantastic book. But it's for those Christians who believe in the Bible. This is the kind of book that would persuade them, or at least open their eyes.
Yeah.
Again, not getting into persuasion, but getting into understanding. And a book like that would help them understand the Book of Mormon more completely, I think.
Yeah.
Which is all we ask for, really.
I think that's
Right.
awesome. And one thought that I had while you were talking is that, and I actually listened to this on a Ward Radio thing recently. Shout out to Ward Radio. But they were talking about how, this feeling, this burning in the bosom, like it's a sign, but it's not the end all be all.
Exactly.
At least that's how it's been in my life. Like I follow the burning in my bosom, and it takes me down a road, but eventually there's more light and knowledge when I start to apply, my intellectual faculties and things like that. It's kind of, it's like a hunch, right? It's a hunch that an investigator has, but then you have to actually go find the evidence, right?
Yeah.
So an investigator has a hunch that someone committed the crime, but that only leads them in the right direction to eventually find all the fruit of that hunch.
Yeah.
And that's how I feel. I feel like a lot of times, yes, we have it be the end all, but it should just be the beginning of a long study and devouring of the scriptures.
Yeah. And I think as well, going back to a lot of times because we've had these experiences, and a lot of times it's from when we're very young.
Mm-hmm.
And so like we've never known a life without having these spiritual convictions,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like think back to when you were in Marine Corps boot camp and infantry training. Like when people ask you, oh, why don't you drink, or why don't you like have sex with girls
Mm-hmm.
and you're not married and stuff. And like if our answer was just like, oh, because God said so, like they would just be like, oh, you freaking weirdo.
Uh-huh.
Like I would always, when I would get asked those questions, like, oh, why don't you drink? You can't drink? I'm like, oh yeah, heck yeah, I can drink.
If I want to.
I drink as much as I want. And they're like, oh, okay. Like, are you a virgin? I'm like, yeah. He's like, oh, so you can't have sex? I'm like, oh no, I have as much sex as I want. And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah, but the problem, not the problem, but the thing is the amount I want to do those things is zero because of the understanding I have of
And
not
here's
only
why.
the God commandments, but I had friends in my life that their parents would get wasted every weekend, and now I look at them and they're divorced and not
Yeah.
super happy with their lives.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, alcohol is probably not the best road to go down.
Mm-hmm.
And then just you can do that with all of the commandments, the law of chastity,
Mm-hmm.
the word of wisdom, and you can find that rational reason to live that, and it's logically going to be better in the end for you. But then you back it up with, oh, it's a commandment from God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good to go. I'm okay with that.
That was one of my favorite things to do actually in the School of Infantry, because I get that a lot. Because there are a lot of there's a lot of people that do not keep our same standards,
Right.
like not even close, right? And it was always awesome when you could give the rational reason for why you don't engage in those same
Yeah.
moral things. And
That's right.
it was one of my favorite things because they think they're so smart and funny or whatever, and then you give the reason and they just be like, cool. Yeah, when they didn't have anything else to say, because they could see that it's not just because you believe in some, fake, to use a... Sorry, I'm having a hard time. I keep saying things that I keep wanting to say things I probably shouldn't say.
The spaghetti monster.
You know what I mean? Yeah. But yeah, it's not because you just believe in some fake spaghetti monster
Right.
that gives you these arbitrary rules, but there's actual rationale for your faith.
But I don't vape because I pass you on the hike every Saturday morning.
Yeah. Yeah.
Basically.
Well, Joseph F. Smith wrote a book called Gospel Doctrine, and he talked about this concept as the education of our desires.
Uh-huh.
He says that's what the gospel does. It changes our desires and our interests.
Yeah.
It's exactly what you were saying about how, I could do it all I want. I just don't want to,
Mhm.
right? And that's kind of the idea behind this rational restoration, too, because all the commandments that we have are rational. It's just how to live a better life, a healthier life, a longer life, a more fulfilled life, a more charitable life,
Mm-hmm.
And so the commandments aren't inhibiting us. They're enabling us to become better people
Yeah, that's awesome.
and to create a better society.
That's cool.
And so I was thinking when you were talking, I used to do some projects in Egypt, and I had two partners there. One was a Coptic Christian and one was a Muslim. And we went to lunch one time, and the Christian was smoking and drinking a beer. The Muslim guy was smoking, but he didn't drink beer,
Yeah, he didn't
and I wasn't doing either. So we had a conversation about why we had these differences. And I told him, well, I have a prophet that says we shouldn't smoke or drink. And the Muslim guy looked at his cigarette and said, if Muhammad was alive today, he'd probably tell me not to smoke too. And he put out a cigarette. And I said, see, that's why we need a modern prophet right there.
That's hilarious.
And in a way, that's the same way with your initial question about why we need more scripture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we have the Bible, and there's thousands of different Christian churches.
Mm-hmm.
This Coptic Christian guy in Egypt had completely different beliefs than, say, a Catholic would.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, when we were in Cairo, there's a place in Cairo where the Coptic Christians kind of live in a neighborhood, and they sort all the trash of the city and stuff. But inside, they have these amazing murals on the walls that they've engraven on the cliffs, and a lot of it are passages from the Bible. And this Muslim guy, I told him I wanted to go see those, and so he drove us in there. He says, I've never been in here because this is the Coptic Christian place, And he was reading these things on the wall, these passages from the New Testament. He said, that is really profound. Where does that come from? And I said, that's from the Bible. And he goes, from the Bible? You're kidding, because he never read the Bible. And he was really impressed with that. And I see that as an example of him just being ignorant of what was available to him. And it gets back to this idea of the scriptures here, that Christians generally are just unaware of what's available to them in the Book of Mormon. You probably know Lynn Ridenauer, the Baptist minister who talks about the Book of Mormon in his ministry.
I've heard of him.
And he's a cool guy. We actually went to one of his sermons, my wife
really?
and I. Yeah. And we went over to his house and talked to him and stuff. And my wife asked his wife what she thought about all this. And she said, "That's funny. No one's ever asked me before."
Yeah.
And she had a really fascinating story and account. But and I actually took him through the Grandin bookstore years ago.
Yeah.
And this was an amazing experience because when we walked in, he looked around. He says, "Are you telling me this is where the Book of Mormon was first printed?" And I said, "Yeah, this is it." And he just started crying. He said, "This is holy ground, you know."
Wow.
And I've never seen a Latter-day Saint person feel that way as he did. And that's because he, even though he's not a member of the church, he loves the Book of Mormon so much that he felt that profound experience there at the Grandin bookstore of all things. And that's what I hope more and more Christians can come to appreciate. Don't just go by what your minister says. As awesome as your minister is, look into it for yourself. You know, read it for yourself.
Read
and
the
make up your own
scriptures.
mind. And it's the same thing I say to Latter-day Saints, you know, don't just take what your scholars are telling you. Read what Joseph Smith actually said. You can't see what Joseph Smith said in the Gospel Topics essay because it's not in there. You have to go to the actual source in the Joseph Smith Papers or somewhere else.
So, well, I'm curious with this guy's situation. I'm not familiar with what's his name.
With this story.
Lynn Ridenauer.
Yeah.
Cool.
If he holds the Book of Mormon in such high regard, then what's his deal?
Well, I don't want to speak for him, but
Yeah.
I can say what he has said.
Okay.
You should connect us with him. We'd love to interview
Oh,
him.
yeah.
That'd
That's
be
so
a cool
interesting.
interview.
Is he the guy that's like preaching from the Book of Mormon, like all
Yeah.
emphatically and
Yeah.
stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, what's up?
Yeah. Well, maybe I shouldn't tell his story. Let him tell it because
Okay.
he has a really interesting story how he first met the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
But although I'd love to, I'll tell his story.
Okay, just tell. Yeah, we'll have him on. People will listen twice.
Okay. So he was a Baptist minister. And he'd gone to, I think, Liberty College, you know, and they had a section on Mormonisms and how Mormon was terrible and the Book of Mormon was of the devil and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Standard stuff.
So, but he moved to Missouri, to Independence, Missouri, and he was at I think it was a dentist, and he said he wanted to find a Christian community, and he says, "Oh, I live in a Christian community. You can move into ours." So he moved into it, and the first night, the next door neighbor brought over a Book of Mormon. And he thought, he's thinking to himself, he didn't want to be rude, but he's thinking to himself, what is this, you know? And so he thanked the guy, he left, he threw it on the floor, he said, and he walked around it, and he said, "I know this is of the devil, but since it's here, I might as well read it." And he picked it up, and as soon as he read the first part of First Nephi, he said he knew it was true. And it shocked him, you know. And it turned out he had moved into a Christian community that was RLDS, Community of Christ people.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he was surrounded by all the Community of Christ people who by then had become more kind of mainstream Christian also.
Yeah.
But
They don't
still
even
love
believe that the
of
book,
Mormon.
but they don't believe it that it's historical, right? They kind of believe the
Well,
Book of Mormon's more of like,
there's a variety. There's factions in there
okay.
as well. In fact, there's an awesome online community that meets every Monday night. I've talked to them a few times, and they have a forum every Monday night. We talk about all Book of Mormon issues. It's called Book of Mormon Forum, I think it is. You guys can check it out.
yeah, we should
someday.
join it.
And then, but there's a group there. We went to their church also in Missouri. And they have a Hill Cumorah expedition almost every year. They go down to southern Mexico looking for the Hill Cumorah.
Yeah.
You know,
I bet they're
It's
still
a-
looking. No, just
they're
kidding.
still looking.
They found it.
Actually, they didn't go this year.
Oh,
It
dang.
turns out. But so I met with them before their services. We had a meeting together, and I gave them an annotated Book of Mormon. Told them my reasons. They gave me their books about Mesoamerica.
Yeah.
You know, they're just really cool people. Had
Yeah.
a really good time. And actually, I think that's when Lynn Ridenauer came and preached there at that little church.
Cool.
But so Lynn is, he feels like he's kind of a bridge builder. He says, by the time I die, you guys can do my temple work and all that. But in the meantime, I can build bridges. That's all he wants to do is kind of introduce the Book of Mormon to
He's an undercover.
Christians.
He's an undercover Mormon.
Yeah, maybe. But
Just kidding.
you know what? One time I was on the High Council and I mentioned him in a talk. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and she says, I was from North Carolina, and the ministers in our town were all preaching from the Book of Mormon, but they didn't tell their congregations. They would just read
Interesting.
the scriptures because they're so full of Christ in the Book of Mormon. And she said it was so funny because we all recognize those scriptures. And there's a chapel in Brooklyn, the former LDS chapel, where and I've been to this place, where they put scriptures, wrote them on the ceiling way up high, but then the church sold the building to a Christian church. And they left those up there because they loved the words so much.
And they're from the Book of Mormon.
From the Book of Mormon, this Baptist church.
That's
So,
pretty cool.
there's a lot of inroads, and I think, one of my missions, I think I talked about in here, is how I want to show the Book of Mormon as a fulfillment of Christian aspirations. And that's where all the Jonathan Edwards stuff comes in, too. That it was not intended to destroy the Christian church at all. It was to build up the Christian church. And Jonathan Edwards had talked about that, and I see it as Edwards' influence as being very important for that reason, because it's a way to reduce or lower the barriers that Christians have erected against the Book of Mormon. And the more they can see that it's all about Christ, it brings people to Christ. And I have this website called Museum of the Book of Mormon. I don't know if you've looked at it.
Yeah, I have.
Called mobom.org. And the point there is that people of all religions can love and appreciate the Book of Mormon. You don't have to join any church. Title page doesn't say the purpose of the Book of Mormon is to get people to join the church, right? And in some ways, using it as a missionary tool impedes the people from accepting the Book of Mormon,
Yeah.
And so I think it's for everybody, for Christians, Hindus, Muslims. Anybody can appreciate the Book of Mormon and learn from it.
And the thing that's awesome from the Christian aspect of it is, and we did a video about this, is it is the only solid evidence that Jesus Christ really is the Savior of the world, and
That's
that he
right.
resurrected.
Yeah,
Because there's
exactly.
if it really is an ancient record, there's no making up, there's no
That's right.
conspiracy across the ocean between them to make up
for
some
sure.
story about this guy appearing with a resurrected body. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah.
And to me, that's what I love so much about the Book of Mormon. What are some other reframes that you have in regard to the Book of Mormon?
Well, I have a lot. We've alluded a little to the geography stuff, but some of the reframes I have in here about the importance of physical evidence. That some people tell me still, they say, well, I don't care about Book of Mormon geography or physical evidence because I have a spiritual testimony.
Yeah.
And I refer them back to Moroni 10. I say, yeah, okay, so you have the gift of great
great faith. Yeah.
But what about the people that have other spiritual gifts?
And as a missionary, that's what I always go back to too. It's like, if we're missionaries, we should be learning how to appeal to people of all different persuasions.
That's right.
Those who don't have that same gift, the same spiritual gift.
And recognize that for some people it takes years of careful study. The Doctrine and Covenants talks about learning by study and faith, right? So there's two components. Some people analogize that to our heart and our mind. There's both of those components. Some people rely completely on their heart. I've met people who don't even read the Book of Mormon, and they're faithful members of the church just because they have that faith, and they love it. And they don't really, some of them are illiterate even, I know there's people in Central America and Africa that are illiterate, but they still join the church.
Yeah.
Just based on the feeling and the vibrant spirituality they feel at church. And that's enough for them. That's fine. They don't have to study in that sense.
Yeah.
Other people study for years, like the examples I gave, where they'll study for years. Yeah, they may have a spiritual feeling, but they've had spiritual feelings in other churches, or beautiful music gives them the same kind of feeling, So for them, the spiritual side isn't as significant as the study side. And there's just a wide range of things. And I love that Moroni told us all that, right, in Moroni 10. We just look over it, So some of the other reframes in here, I talk about, the Zelph account, the physical evidence of Cumorah, and so on. The purpose of the Book of Mormon, as I just mentioned, is to bring people to Christ, not necessarily to get them to join our church. Reframing Joseph's knowledge. Some people say, well, Joseph Smith was just an ignorant farm boy, right? The Lord just kind of tapped him like Order of the Arrow where you get tapped out, that he just got tapped and became a prophet. Where, in my view, the Lord prepared Joseph Smith from a young age to become a prophet and a translator. So he even said on one occasion, someone asked him to tell him the history of the restoration, and he said it started when I was a young boy, about 6 years old. And that's when he became a religious seeker. And I love that approach because what I find when I do firesides on this, especially with young people, and Joseph Smith, for them, is just a remote, almost an alien. that he's just praying in the woods and God appears to him and then gives him this book and a stone. He just has to read the words. That is all weird stuff. But if you look at Joseph Smith as just like any of us, he had a near-death experience as a young boy. He became a religious seeker. He read Christian writings. He asked ministers questions. He studied the scriptures himself, he said in his own history. He became such a religious seeker that it's almost like the brother Jared. The Lord couldn't withhold himself from revealing to him. And that's an opportunity that's available to all of us if we become religious seekers. How many times does the Lord say, "Seek and ye shall find," right? And Joseph Smith is the epitome of that. But it doesn't make him an alien or some special thing like that. He is a prototypical story for each one of us. And I found that myself in my own life,
Yeah.
And so what I try to tell the youth and anybody who else is interested on your podcast is that if you want answers, you have to seek them. And Joseph sought answers for his whole life.
Yeah. Cool. That's awesome. I want to kind of go back a little bit.
Sure.
I want to talk a little bit more about your claim that it's like the Book of Mormon's to bring people to Christ, not to have them join our church. I want to explain that a little bit more. What do you mean by that? What is the difference between bringing people to Christ or having them join our church by doing the ordinances and stuff?
Okay. Well, obviously, to come to Christ, according in the Doctrine and Covenants, means accepting the ordinances. But it's almost a two-stage process, because you can come to Christ. There's devout Christians who have come unto Christ, but they don't join our church. And there's all kinds of reasons why people don't join the church, even if they believe in Christ, right? And so and I think Brigham Young even said that in the millennium there will be people of all different denominations. And they can all come to Christ, but that next step of accepting the church despite all the issues with the polygamy or the, being offended and all the things that people have, that's kind of second step. Now, I just point out, you look at the title page. What does it say? What are the two things the Book of Mormon is intended for? Do you remember? From the title
witness
page?
of Jesus Christ,
convincing people
of the Jews and Gentiles,
and restore the covenants.
Exactly. To tell the people. Well, let's read the title
let's
page.
open it up right now.
Because I've got it here handy somewhere.
Dude, that's my one qualm with the annotated Book of Mormon, bro. It has its own introduction, but it doesn't have the introduction that's found in
It's got to have it in there.
It has the title page, though.
It has the title page.
That's what we care about.
So here's the title page.
It says it in
right
the
here.
title page, too. I don't have any qualms with this book. It's amazing.
Okay.
Well, I'm glad it doesn't have the introduction that's in there, because there's a fake quote in the introduction that grates me every time I read it.
Okay, we're going to have to talk about that.
Okay, so we'll say this. So this is what it says. That they may know the covenants of so these are the reasons. So it says, which is to show unto the remnant of the house of Israel what great things the Lord hath done for their fathers, that they may know the covenants of the Lord, that they are not cast off forever, and also to the convincing of the Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God, manifesting himself to all nations. Okay, cool. So there's these two purposes, and what you're saying is that second purpose that says the convincing of the Jew and Gentile, it can play that role without them joining the church. But that first promise of understanding the covenants that God has given, that's kind of like the next step.
Right, exactly. It's a two-step thing. And that's why, see, for me, I think it's easier for Christians or Hindus or Muslims or anybody to accept, to see the Book of Mormon as convincing them that Jesus is the Christ. Just like you said earlier, the New Testament is fine, but that ended a long time ago, and there's no other evidence that Christ was resurrected. But now Joseph Smith is saying, yeah, he's resurrected. He appeared to me. Not only that, here's a record of an entire 1,000 years of people who knew Christ in a different continent, right? That convinces people.
For sure.
But it only convinces people if the Book of Mormon itself is convincing. And that gets back to the physical evidences for some people, right?
Yeah.
But the second part is the covenants, and that's entering into those covenants. It doesn't say, it says to teach them the covenants. It doesn't say to enter the covenants. That could be a later stage, right?
Next stage, yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So and plus we all know that there's other denominations that accept the Book of Mormon. It's not just Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
So they've all accepted the Book of Mormon, but they don't accept the same temple covenants, right? So I look at it as two phases, and I focus on the one convincing people that Jesus is the Christ, because that's the preliminary one.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go, because when you see the Book of Mormon as a tool to bring your connection personally closer to Jesus Christ, then other things that, are a part of the church, like, I always hate when people say, like, and can you believe he was a bishop and did that? Or such and such did this. And that kind of has weight and effect on their testimony, because there's these other faithful people that accept the Book of Mormon as well, but maybe they've fallen off the path. And so I think if you're first rooted in the fact that this book brings you closer to Jesus Christ, then you can recognize, oh, that's unfortunate that someone, fell off the path, but it's not like I'm hooked. My testimony is hooked to them, if that makes sense.
And that's why I say in the Museum of the Book of Mormon, you don't have to join any church to love the Book of Mormon. And Lynn Ridenauer is an example of that.
Yeah.
He loves the Book of Mormon, more so than most LDS that I've ever seen in the Grand and Print shop, And there's other people who love the Book of Mormon. Some of them don't even know where it came from. You've all heard those stories, right? They just love this book. I don't know where it came from. And then they find out it's, from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I think it's important for us all as members of the church to recognize that the book brings people to Christ, most importantly. Whether they join the church or not is secondary. And if we took that attitude more often, I think it would help missionaries, member missionaries as well as called missionaries, to share the Book of Mormon.
For sure.
Because you wouldn't be feeling like, if you read this, you'll join my church,
And more people probably would, in the end, join the church when they recognize that and take that step. I wanted to ask you, I wasn't planning on asking this question or going down this route, but you brought up this point that there are other factions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that spawn, and they believe in the Book of Mormon, but there's differences. You've done a lot of like interfaith work with these different groups. Why is it that you choose the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints over the Community of Christ Church or these other factions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
That's a really interesting question.
Convenience.
Convenience. Because I live in Utah.
Ward house down the road.
I already got baptized in them.
Next question.
No, but
well,
That's a good question.
This is an interesting. I went to high school in Phoenix, Arizona.
Okay.
And my math teacher was a member of the Reorganized Church.
Okay.
And we used to hassle each other constantly.
Yeah.
And so I was pretty familiar with them from way back.
That's cool.
And I've one time I was an early adopter of technology all my life, but I bought drones when they first came out, and I was out in Independence, and I took drone shots of that temple they have. It looks like a snail shell.
Oh yeah, like the space temple.
Yeah,
is what it looks
Does
like.
it have the Angel Moroni on top?
No, it doesn't.
No.
Okay.
But I flew the drone all over it, on top of it and everything. And I was at a conference out there, and I showed the footage to some people. And the sponsors, I guess, were from our LDS. Maybe it's the Mormon History Association. I don't remember for sure. But they said, can we use that footage? I said, sure. I gave it to them because we've tried to get helicopter shots, but we can't get that close to the building.
Yeah.
No one had seen drone shots at this time, So I gave them the footage, and they used it in their closing ceremonies and stuff.
That's awesome.
So I have a great appreciation for the members of that church, the Community of Christ. And like I mentioned, we have this forum, and they love the Book of Mormon, and they know the Book of Mormon really well. One of them in particular is a fantastic historian and archaeologist of Nauvoo. And I spent some time in Nauvoo with him looking at some of the discoveries they've made and so on. It's just fantastic.
Yeah.
And so for me, though, I look at it as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is fulfilling the prophecies. No one else is a worldwide church, building temples everywhere, having all the ordinances and covenants. And people who look at it, well, in the case of the Reorganized Church, a lot of the problem had to do with the polygamy issue, right? And as well as the priesthood restrictions. Those two things really stuck in their craw, sort of, understandably, And so to me, those are history. And there's explanations for them. People have a variety of opinions. But today, they don't really matter. I look at what's happening today. And I probably told you guys, maybe I haven't, that I'm a pathway missionary. My wife and I trained
I didn't know that.
We trained all the pathway missionaries in South America. I should turn this off. Sorry about that.
It's all good. Don't worry about it.
But we trained all the pathway missionaries in South America, except for Brazil. In fact, my wife's doing a crunch in the last few days because the semester starts this week, and there's a whole bunch of missionaries backed up we have to train. And we also teach Institute online. But I see the pathway program as revolutionizing the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when we lived in Africa, we went to a meeting with Pathway students, and this was in Madagascar, and there were about 40 of them in the congregation, and they all had to speak English to be in Pathway, but they were very articulate, very smart, aggressive, determined, wonderful, faithful Latter-day Saints. But the Pathway program was enabling them to improve their living standards for their families and their communities. And that was just a small sample. I think there's now something like 80,000 Pathway students.
Mm-hmm.
And the church has asked us to prepare for 1 million, which to me, I mean, that's fulfillment of Scripture right there.
Yeah.
And so I don't see any other church anywhere doing what our church is doing.
Yeah.
And so definitely that's why I want to be part of it,
Mm-hmm.
And there's the spiritual convictions and all that. But since we're talking about rational relation,
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the rational side of it. So,
I think with me, to go along with that, it's the temple. I like temple worship, and especially after the last couple podcasts Jackson and I have done that will be released when this one is, like the temple is in the Book of Mormon, very clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not very clearly, but those who have eyes to see and ears to hear see it. And all the other offshoots just kind of dispense with the endowment.
Mm-hmm.
They dispense with the temple worship, and
Right.
I can't dispense with that. It's so beautiful, and there's so much light and knowledge to be had within the walls of a temple.
Here's a fun example of that. I was in Oklahoma City one time, and a friend of mine was telling me when they had the open house for the Oklahoma City Temple, they had some Baptist ministers come through, and they were talking to the stake president. He was explaining what we do in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And they went away from there saying, we should be doing baptisms for the dead. And they started doing baptisms for the dead in Oklahoma City. He took me to the church where they do those.
No way. Wait,
Yes.
what church is this called?
Well, it's one of the Baptist churches. It's, they have a lot of different denominations, but
In Oklahoma.
Oklahoma City, yeah.
Hey, A for effort, maybe
Well,
I don't know.
but I mean-
I don't know the implications of that, but A for effort,
Well, but that's a good example where they say it's right in the Scriptures,
Mhm.
and it's the only way you can reconcile the justice of God, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you have to be baptized. Another time I had the missionaries asked me to come with them because they had a difficult investigator, right?
Yeah.
And so I went over with him, and the guy said, all right, I've read, I think he said 30 pages of your Book of Mormon, but I'm not going to read another word until you tell me this is a real history.
Mhm.
Because I looked on the internet, you guys don't
They're
even know
saying
where it
it's
took
not.
place,
Mhm.
you don't know all this. But in the process of that, the missionaries ended up kind of dropping him as an investigator and turning him over to me. So I spent a lot of time with
Yeah.
him. We went to each other's church and stuff. But he said, I asked him, I said, so what do you think about all the people who never heard of Christ? And he said, I never really thought about that. And I said, well, it says they have to be baptized. How's that going to happen? And he said, yeah, that's a good question. He'd been a part-time minister, so he was pretty familiar with all this. By the time we ended up, he said, well, you've convinced me the Book of Mormon is in New York, and you convinced me we need baptism for the dead.
So I guess I'll get
But
baptized.
I don't know how I can't explain everything else, but I guess in the next life we'll both sort it out. And I said,
Yeah.
cool, that's good enough for me. But seriously, I think Christians that think about these things recognize there has to be baptism for the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And where is it being done? Only in our temples.
Uh-huh.
Well, unless you go to the Baptist Church in Oklahoma City.
Exactly.
Right?
There's one other part.
That is a reason, and I know we have a lot of Christian watchers. I can't go anywhere else. I've looked into the other Christian churches.
Yeah.
I went through my period of time where I was like, if I find out that this is all false, I'm going to become a Baptist or an evangelical or whatever.
Yeah.
Some other Protestant religion. But I can't, because, and one of the biggest solidifying factors in that was when I went to India and we were driving in this obscure town and I saw this beautiful 6-year-old little girl and I was like, she's never even heard of Jesus,
Yeah.
but she's just going to hell.
Yeah.
Oh no, but baptism doesn't matter. Believing in Christ, like that's fine. That's an extreme that I can't swallow
Right.
either, is that there are no rules,
Yeah.
that Jesus Christ doesn't actually ask of things for our
Yeah.
salvation. And I also can't swallow the thing that she's just going to hell, that God created her out of nothing and to be damned to hell for eternity because she never heard of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I can't go anywhere else.
Yeah.
But
If
see,
any
that-
of you have a better idea out there, I'll go to it, but I just can't find it.
Well, and that's their problem. They can't reconcile what Christ said, or you have to be baptized, or you can't enter the kingdom of heaven.
That was
their
figurative,
teaching.
Jonathan.
Yeah,
It's
figurative. Uh-huh. Except he did it himself.
Exactly. And the thing about the baptism thing, what was the last charge that he gave to the apostles?
Yeah.
Go ye therefore and preach unto all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
Like, if that wasn't...
It's just though if they want to, though.
Yeah.
It's just if they want it. Like, it's not necessary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Talking about rational faith and everything, me and Hayden have had so many awesome opportunities to speak with a lot of you that, think very differently than us, to an extreme to where you take God completely out of the translation of the Book of Mormon. And so I'm curious, have you heard any like naturalistic or rational explanation for the Book of Mormon that like even makes sense?
Well, the Spalding theory makes sense if you look at
Which,
it.
for those of you that don't know, what's
the
a
idea
brief
of the
summary
Spalding
of the
theory is
Spalding
that
theory?
Sidney Rigdon, a man named Solomon Spalding wrote a book about a novel, essentially, about the mound builders in Ohio. He lived in Ohio.
Okay.
And that he sent it off to Philadelphia to get published, and it was never published. And that Sidney Rigdon knew the publishers.
Yeah.
So he stole the manuscript, added a bunch of Christian sermons to it, met with Joseph Smith and said, hey, let's publish this book. And so Joseph Smith would sit behind a screen and read this manuscript to the scribes.
Mm-hmm.
That's the theory of this Spalding manuscript.
Yeah, and that was a very compelling theory for many, many years.
Oh, yeah, it was.
But then what kind of
that's
undermined it?
The book Mormonism Unveiled was the one that talked about it at length.
Mm-hmm.
And even when it says Mormonism Unveiled, the only time in the book they talk about the veil is that's the veil between Joseph and the scribes.
Yeah, he spelled veil wrong, too.
He did.
He spelled unveiled wrong. So.
Well, but spelling wasn't standardized back then. So.
Okay.
But that's why David Whitmer and Emma and a few others insisted that that Joseph had his face in a hat, because then he had nothing to read from.
Yeah.
No manuscript to read from. She even said he had no manuscript to read from, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because of the Solomon Spalding theory. But then in, I don't remember the dates, but in the mid-1800s, the guy who had the print shop that published the Mormonism Unveiled sold out to someone who took it to Hawaii, everything to Hawaii.
Uh-huh.
Dude over there opened the crate, found this manuscript by Solomon Spalding.
Found the actual manuscript. There had been lots,
Yeah,
right? It just
that's right.
Theorized
No
about.
one knew it existed, but he had it. So he sent it to Oberlin College, and the president there announced it, and the RLDS and LDS Church both published it because it had nothing to do with the Book of Mormon.
Really?
Yeah.
What is it about?
Well, it's about, as I recall, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but it's about the Ohio and the Indians and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't. The language and the narrative is completely different from the Book of Mormon. So it definitely Joseph Smith didn't read it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's still people today that say, well, okay, that was one manuscript that Spalding wrote, but maybe he wrote another one that was the one Joseph Smith used. So it never ends.
Mm-hmm.
But that pretty much debunked the whole Spalding theory.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the most logical, natural explanation,
Mhm.
right? And that's why it was so widely accepted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I can't think of any other ones. Like, how many people have to be involved? This is what I want to. I want to sit down with a critic and be like, okay, tell me exactly how many people were involved in it.
Yeah.
And once you start playing that game and you ask them to be very specific, because what happens a lot of times is the critics will just throw a bunch of mud and they'll be like, look how much stuck. But it's like those were different globs of mud that you threw. And all together it makes it messy, but you can't find one glob of mud that covers up and provides a better thing.
And I even talked to a guy the other day that I asked him, okay, logically, tell me all the dirty details. Like, how did Joseph do it? Did he have co-conspirators? Was he a lone wolf working alone and he duped everyone? Like, how did he actually do it? So he sends me like long messages essentially summarizing that he believes that Joseph Smith took from all these other contemporary 19th century
So
resources.
he did intense research and study.
Knew all of this stuff, was a biblical genius. Like, essentially, that's the assumption you have to have with all these interwoven principles and everything. And that he used that to work alone and produce the Book of Mormon. And he had years to prepare. He said that he started from the time that he claimed that Moroni visited him. Mm-hmm. But there's one unavoidable fact that you have to have faith in, because there's no evidence to support this, but you have to have faith in the fact that Joseph Smith memorized 269,000 words and dictated it in a single string, obviously over 60 days, but without any manuscript, keeping consistent perfectly with storyline chronology, with multiple flashbacks in the narrative of the Book of Mormon. And and he's just that smart
Mm-hmm.
that he just did that perfectly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like they revere Joseph Smith more than we do.
Honestly.
If you think about it,
Yeah.
they think more highly of his intellect and his being and his capacity than even I do, because I choose to put my faith in God, that God inspired him and did all the work through Joseph Smith, and he was the tool. They make Joseph Smith in this scenario God, and a super genius that is able to memorize. Dude, it's just so funny to me.
Well,
It's crazy.
But see, that brings up the whole stone in the hat problem too, because the other supernatural explanation is that some supernatural person, entity, put the words on the stone, and we believe, those who believe the stone in the hat theory think it was God who did it. Those who don't, like the Book of Mormon, think Satan did it. And how do you tell the difference? You know, there's literally no way. If it came from a stone in a hat, then all bets are off. That's why I think the translation that Joseph Smith said all along, he never varied from that. He always said, I translated, I don't know how many times he had to say it, but I translated the engravings on the plates with the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates.
Yeah.
And that seems almost self-evident when you look at what happened. And so it's frustrating to me that people promote the stone in the hat theory without even mentioning what Joseph actually said.
For sure.
You know, over and over, I've seen a lot of these Come Follow Me podcasts, and several of them say, well, Joseph never really said that much about the translation, and all he said was by the gift and power of God, and that's all false, because he told explicitly how he did it.
Multiple times.
Yeah.
The
The very first thing he said in his history is, I copied the characters and translated them with the Urim and Thummim. I mean, if you copy the characters, he wasn't reading words off the stone in the hat. And so this whole stone in the hat thing originated, I don't know if we want to get into that, but it originated with an article that was published in Palmyra in September of 1829 by Jonathan Hadley. And he hated the Mormons. He didn't want anything to do with them, and he tried to destroy them. He even said he would do that.
So this was before the Book of Mormon was even published.
Yeah, it was right after it was printed. Right after the title page was printed. But that's all that was printed.
Yeah, that was all that was printed.
Yeah. And so he wrote that article, and it was distributed in newspapers all over. It even ended up in Ohio, and that's one of the things that led to the Mormonism Unveiled.
Yeah.
So you remember in 1830 edition, Joseph Smith wrote a preface. Do you have an 1830 around here? 1830
I don't have
edition?
an 1830 edition, unfortunately.
You should donate an original copy of the Book
I
of Mormon.
should, shouldn't I?
Hey, anyone out there that is like rolling in the dough or something, buy us one and send it here.
Or we could give you a replica.
They're only like
That's our
100K.
fourth level of Patreon support.
Yeah.
That's what you need.
$100,000+ original copy of the Book of Mormon. And we'll give you our ad-free content. Content ad-free.
Well, here's one funny story about that. I had a friend who said, hey, I know you like church history. Come over to my house. I'll show you something. So I went over. He had an original 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon on his shelf. So he gave it to me. I opened the cover, and his grandkids had crayoned all over it.
Oh.
And and I said, what? And he goes, my grandkids are more important than some old book, And I appreciated that. I 100% agreed with him.
It's the words that matter, not the physical
it's like
thing.
I'd
I'd still be mad at my kid.
Gave us a signed pair of like goalkeeper gloves from Nick Armando that used to play for RSL, and I immediately put them on and went in the backyard and played with them.
And they got destroyed, huh?
It's like,
It's true.
yeah.
But I keep that in my mind all the time when I talk about collectors and how much things cost and all that, because it's fun.
It's just a material thing, though.
People used to collect stamps. Now they collect old Book of Mormon, whatever. But it doesn't affect really the words of the book. But the point I was bringing that up is in the 1830 edition, there's a preface that Joseph Smith wrote that was not in our current version. And the preface is really important to understand this whole stone in the hat thing.
Yeah.
Because it's, I could pull it up on my phone.
I'll pull it up right here. So keep talking and I'll pull it up.
But he addressed these rumors that were going around, the false reports, which was based on this article by Jonathan Hadley. The article said that Joseph Smith put the spectacles in a hat, and that's how he translated it, which would mean the Urim and Thummim, which he wasn't allowed to show anybody, so obviously it was a hearsay statement to begin with.
Yeah.
No one could have seen him put spectacles in a hat.
I have the preface here.
Okay, so read just the first sentence.
Okay. As many false reports have been circulated respecting the following work, and also my unlawful
Many unlawful.
Not his. Also many unlawful measures taken by evil designing persons to destroy me, and also the work. I would inform you that I translated by the gift and power of God, and caused to be written 116 pages, which I took from the Book of Lehi, which was an account abridged from the plates of Lehi by the hand of Mormon.
That's good. Okay, so
He
see
doesn't
what
use
he's.
much punctuation there. It's a run-on sentence.
Yeah, it's a really long sentence.
Well, the Book of Mormon is one run-on.
Yeah,
long
that's all it
run-on
was.
sentence. But here's the reason this is so important is he talks about the many false reports that have circulated, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's that Jonathan Hadley article that started the whole stone in the hat thing.
Yeah.
And how did he refute it? He emphasized, I translated, right, by the gift and power of God. And then what does he say again?
He says that
said he took it from the plates, right?
from the 106 yes.
Which I took from the Book of Lehi, the 116 pages.
Which were on the plates, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So he's right there. He's
The
saying
plates of Lehi.
these false reports that I put the spectacles in a hat. I'm refuting those by emphasizing I translated it and I took it from the plates.
It would have been nice if he specifically said that, though. I
would've
will
been.
have to say he doesn't specifically say that.
He doesn't specifically say it, but there's a reason why he wouldn't too.
But there were also other false reports. That wasn't the only false report. I will say, because there was also Obadiah Dogberry,
right,
who was publishing things about the Book of Mormon and saying that he's making it all up, and he falsely published the first chapter, right?
Right.
So there are multiple false
That's
reports than just
right.
the stone in the hat,
Right.
right?
But the Obadiah Dogberry thing wasn't circulated widely that I know of,
Mm-hmm.
whereas the other one was.
Yeah.
And he says these false reports have been circulated.
Mm-hmm.
And to refute it, what does he say? He says, I translated.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say it's a different story than Obadiah Dogberry gave, So he's refuting specifically the idea that he didn't translate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And he says he took it from the plates, which also refutes the idea that he read it off a stone.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, what's so interesting to me is after we had our first conversation about this, I didn't even know that this was like a thing, a debate between people. And then I kind of took the position at first. I'm like, why does it even matter? We have the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And then I'm like, but I wanted to look into it more. And so I went to Ether in chapter 3 where the Lord kind of talks about the Urim and Thummim. And he's talking to the brother of Jared. And he says... I'll start in verse 22 of chapter 3. It says, And behold, when ye shall come unto me, ye shall write them and shall seal them up, that no one can interpret them. For ye shall write them in a language that they cannot read. And behold, these two stones will I give unto thee, and ye shall seal them up also with the things which ye shall write. For behold, the language which ye shall write I have confounded. Wherefore I will cause in my own due time that these stones shall magnify to the eye of men these things which ye shall write. And so if it didn't matter, then why would they go through all this trouble to give the spectacles to, in this case, the brother of Jared here, preserve them all this time if he was just going to cover up the plates and look at a stone in the hat? And I'm not talking definitively here, but this is a sincere question for people that hold that view.
That's right.
It's like, why would the Lord go through all this trouble to preserve these spectacles, which he specifically says, I have prepared these that they shall, that in my own due time, that these stones shall magnify to the eyes of men these things which ye shall write.
Yeah. And to go along with that, I think it would be really good to take the faith model, for example, of just recognizing here are the facts. We have X amount of accounts that say that he used a stone in the hat. Not all of them were antagonistic towards Joseph Smith or the Book of Mormon, right?
Right.
So we just lay out that, and then we say, well, if you assume that these ones are correct, then you would come to this conclusion. If you assume these ones are correct, you come to this conclusion. And just kind of leave it there instead of making it's obvious fact that Joseph Smith used the Seer stone, or it's obvious fact that he only used the Urim and Thummim. Let's just lay it all out. And I think maybe that's where people get frustrated, because I think a lot of historians, they focus on the F part the most.
Yeah.
And then some historians will focus on they'll go through the whole faith model and come up with a hypothesis based on that, right?
Right.
But I think it's enough to just lay out, these people said this, these people said this. We don't know definitively because we can't know definitively, but if you assume that Joseph Smith told everything, then you would believe that he just used a Urim and Thummim. If you don't assume that, then you would think that he used a seer stone as well.
And I would follow up by saying that why it's significant, why I think Joseph Smith made such a big point that he used the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates was because of this problem I mentioned earlier. If it came off a stone on the hat, what was the source?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if he used the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates, the only source was God, right? If he used a stone he found in a well, the source could be anything.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that is so destructive of faith to say he read it off of a stone in the hat, because first off, you have to disregard what Joseph Smith himself said, but then you have to say, well, what was the source of the words on that stone? You know, a lot of Christians think that the Book of Mormon is a tool of the devil to deceive them, right?
Yeah.
And that makes sense from their perspective if he read it off a stone in a hat. It doesn't make sense if he used the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's a big deal.
What I will say, though, along with that, is that, okay, so you have one stone in a hat, or you have two stones in silver glasses. You know what I mean? Like, from their point of view, it's like I get it's written in the story.
That's a little misleading, though.
No, let me finish it. I'm not saying that they're the same. What I'm saying is that God could use a stone in a well.
Yeah,
He could.
Sure.
So it's just kind of like, that's where I'm at, is like, he could use the stone in a well. Yes, it opens up to interpretation, but also I think Christians could also make the point that the things that he found with those plates is a tool of the devil as well.
Yeah, sure. Okay. But what I was getting at is, if he's reading off a stone in the hat, there's no connection to the plates. If he's looking on the plates with the Urim and Thummim, that's a whole different deal. Yeah,
I agree.
No, yeah. I mean, it's such a huge question mark, because how it just became the widely accepted narrative with clear controversy.
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 With clear
there you go.
controversy. I'm like, I wonder why they went that way, because we even, which a guy that we won't name, we reached out to a former historian of the church. And we're like, hey, we want to have you on to talk about this. And he said,
to share the side of the side of the stone in the hat.
Yeah.
We're like, we want to hear the pro stone in the hat.
Oh, I could make that argument.
Right?
And
Sure.
he was a church historian for a number of years, and he said, I haven't made up my mind yet. I'm still studying.
And we're just like, wait a second. What?
Well, this is, you know how I'm critical of the gospel topics essays, right? And it's because they don't even show what Joseph and Oliver said. They're very outcome determinative. They want people to believe the stone in the hat. And I think it gets back to the Moroni 10 again that we started with. For some people, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right? They just have the gift of great faith. For people who study it out and they know what the church history is and they can see all the facts, they say, wait a minute, why would any faithful member promote a theory that contradicts what Joseph Smith said? And why not talk about, even if you don't want to agree with what Joseph Smith said, we should every Latter-day Saint should know what he said.
Yeah,
exactly.
So as you said, the F part of the facts part is where we should begin.
Yeah, I guess you could. I think that's a fair point to make, that the gospel topics essays are hypothesis.
Yeah,
they're the H part of the faith model, where they should probably be the whole faith model, where they show here's the facts, here's different assumptions you could make, here's multiple hypotheses that could come from
exactly. That would be, and I think we're going to end up there because the church released this new analysis of how to answer gospel questions a few weeks ago.
Oh, I haven't seen that yet.
And if you take that analysis and the approach that they give, and you compare it to the gospel topics essays, the gospel topics essays don't live up to it. Yeah. So they're going to have to revise the gospel topics essays.
Interesting.
Because they are pretty one-sided on a few of the subjects.
Well, they just ignore relevant historical facts, like what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said. I mean, do you think you'd start with that instead of delete it?
For sure.
So,
have either of you heard of the website Mormoner.com?
Yeah.
I just barely discovered that recently. Shout out to Baylor Johnson that sent that to me.
Yeah.
Dude, I love that because it gives like the whole rundown of all of the different accounts, labels them as firsthand, secondhand, hearsay, eyewitness, all of that. And I love how you can just read all of the facts, and it gives backstory to each of these different accounts and when they came from, who they came from. And yeah, it shouldn't be. I feel like, yeah, maybe the Gospel Topics essays do kind of put forth someone else's hypothesis,
Yeah,
if you will. But
for sure. And, I think we're just past the day. With the advent of the internet, we're past the day where we want filtered information. You know what I mean?
Right.
We used to trust the news to give us, to filter the information and give us that. I don't know about you. I don't trust any sides of the news. I don't trust any news network at all.
Yeah.
We're past the days where we want filtered hypotheses. We want the facts so that we can plug in our own assumptions and then, come to our own hypotheses in the end, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we try to do on this channel. I want to talk a little bit, going along the same route, the CES letter, right? That is a perfect explanation of, here are the facts that pertain specifically to my hypothesis, which is that the church was made up and that Joseph Smith is a fraud and that everything is bad, right? And so kind of talk a little bit, because you spent some time with the CES letter debunking it. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, at some point we could go through it point by point, but just as an overview, it seems like he starts off with the Book of Mormon, of course.
Yes.
And he talks
right
about
for the throat.
The keystone.
Anachronisms and all that stuff. And when I read through his list, it looks to me like he's just assuming that Joseph Smith didn't translate it. It's like, and he has good reason to assume that, because that's what the Gospel Topics essays basically say. So if you go from the perspective that Joseph Smith just read these words off a stone, they had to come directly from God, then all his objections make sense. But if you think Joseph Smith actually translated it, then none of his objections make sense.
Yeah.
And I kind of developed the aphorism that evidence of composition is also evidence of translation. And the reason for that is these people, like, they talk about the late war and these, the other things.
The similarities.
Yeah. Well, if those, in order to translate the Book of Mormon, he had to have the language in his mind.
A word bank. Yeah.
Yeah. The mental language bank, I've called it. And so that would naturally come out. And I did a fun little exercise one time where I took something Dan Vogel wrote, and I showed all the sources that could have come from and how he plagiarized the whole thing. Because they're common words. If they weren't common words, we couldn't communicate. And so for them to say, well, in the War of 1812, what was it? The
Late War.
The Late War. In the Late War,
Napoleon,
there's all these things about, wars that are similar. I said, well, yeah, that's a common language. How else would you say it, right?
And it was written in King James English on purpose.
Yeah, and it would involve, that's one of the things early on. I thought Joseph modeled the Book of Mormon on the Late War for two reasons. One is, at the end of the Late War, or at the beginning, I guess, Mitchell, that professor in New York, had endorsed it as a good book for students to read. And so I think Joseph Smith saw that and told Martin Harris, hey, go get an endorsement from this guy, Mitchell. And the way it's structured at the beginning, too, with the copyright and the preface and all that, is similar to the 1830 edition. That doesn't bother me at all, though, because Joseph Smith, I assume, had read that book, as well as the other ones that people cite as influences. Of course, I talked a lot about Jonathan Edwards, but that's how the Lord prepared him to be a translator. He couldn't have some illiterate person be a translator. And when, in his 1832 history, Joseph said he had an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations. So all along, people assumed he knew all these ministers of different denominations, but it only talked about meeting one that he had the confrontation with. And so when I read that now, I think, well, he had an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations through their writings. And that's how the Lord prepared him to become the translator that he was.
Yeah, interesting.
And so he would read, as we talk about in this book, this by the means of the Urim and Thummim book, what we think he did was the Urim and Thummim would give him a literal translation of the characters, which would include a variety of possibilities. So, for example, when we lived in China, we'd see a Chinese sign, we'd get our Google Translate on our phone and look at it, and it kept flipping between a variety of possible interpretations in English. And we had to pick one of those. And that's what I think the Urim and Thummim did. Very similar. And so he would have to change the grammar. He would have to apply it to his own culture using the language in his head and even the concepts in his head. The example I always give is the natural man is an enemy to God, right? King Benjamin. And King Benjamin just makes the statement, but he doesn't really explain how that is. You have to look at Jonathan Edwards' sermon on natural men are enemies of God to understand how the natural man is an enemy to God. Just like in the Book of Mormon, it talks about the law of Moses but never explains it. You have to go to the Bible to learn what the law of Moses is. So Joseph Smith used a lot of shorthand like that when he was translating. He would read what King Benjamin said, and he says, yeah, that sounds like what Jonathan Edwards said about the natural man as an enemy to God. So that's how he put it in there.
Yeah.
And it's awesome when you see it that way. And it's evidence that he was the actual translator, like he said. He was using words and phrases and concepts he was familiar with.
Yeah, I wish I could just talk to Joseph Smith. It bothers me so bad.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, who knows, too? Like, if he would have lived longer, how much more he maybe would have shared in his older years or whatever, but that obviously was not written in the cards.
You know what Wilford Woodruff said?
What's that?
After Joseph died, he had a dream with Joseph Smith. And he said, if I'd have known you were going to die so soon, I would have asked you all these other questions. And Joseph Smith said, it's not my fault you didn't ask. You know?
He really had a dream?
Yeah, he did. And you can see that. I could see how the brethren at the time, they were so busy building Nauvoo and surviving, building their houses and just trying to, live.
Yeah.
They probably had a million questions and they never dreamed
and they're like,
die.
we'll figure it out. We'll figure it. He'll tell us eventually.
I'll ask him next year, whatever.
Oh, man. So, I know. That makes me, I wish we could talk to him because another thought that I have is, obviously translation is taking abstract ideas and then putting them in language. It's just like maybe somehow these allowed him to like absorb the abstract ideas as he looked at the ancient characters, and then he was just cloaking them in the language as he understood them in his head. He wasn't actually maybe seeing anything. Right. Maybe he was just looking at the characters through them, helped him understand them.
Well, he had to study it out in his mind for sure. Yeah. We know that. But just the fact that he started off by copying the characters and translating them. And I think both Oliver Cowdery and Parley Pratt said that he learned the language.
Yeah. When was okay? Real quick.
Yeah.
When was that the scripture D&C 9 with Oliver Cowdery? How far into the translation process?
I think it was in April.
In April, and they finished translating in
June.
In June. Okay, so they were already into it, and Oliver Cowdery was involved, so it was already after the 116 had been lost. If he was using the stone in the hat, then why would he need to study out in his mind?
Well, that too.
Right. That's the thought that I had.
Well, and remember in DNC 9 it tells Oliver Cowdery, well, you couldn't translate. Don't worry. Finish this work, and then I have additional records you can help translate. And everybody speculates. So what are the additional records? Yeah. Right in DNC 10 it says now you're going to have to translate from the plates of Nephi. Translate the engravings on the plates of Nephi. That was the additional record that he didn't have in Harmony. He didn't get those till he went to Fayette.
Okay, let's talk about that. Okay, can we talk about this? Because a lot of people don't know about this theory that there were actually two different sets of plates. It's just there was the Nephi, the small plates of Nephi was just tacked on at the end of the document, right? Tell us about the whole two sets of plates thing.
Okay, and this is appropriate because we started reading the title page, right? What does the title page say?
It says a lot of things.
But I mean as far as what was in the plates. It says it's a abridgment of the record of the Nephites and the Lamanites, and it's also an abridgment also of the record of the Jaredites, the people of Jared.
Yeah.
That's all. That's all it says. And then Moroni says he sealed it, so he added his portion.
Yeah.
So when I read that, I thought, okay, so there's no mention of any original plates of Nephi in there. And remember, Joseph Smith said that the title page was a literal translation, and it was from the last leaf of the plates. So it's the very last leaf. By the way, speaking of the stone and the hat on this, it's kind of funny. I was at Education Week one year, and we had a professor up there talking about the whole translation coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And he mentioned this, that Joseph Smith said the title page was a literal translation from the last leaf of the plates. And then he said, but we have no idea how he knew that because he wasn't using the plates. That's how ridiculous this has gotten.
Interesting. Yeah.
Joseph Smith said it was the last leaf of the plates. Well, okay, he had to be using the plates to know that, right?
It wasn't
That
just put
actually
away in a
bothers
corner.
me.
I know.
It's interesting.
Well, and most of the audience is like, wow. And I'm like, what? So the whole thing was ridiculous.
That's true. Yeah.
But that's
Doesn't
the
make a
kind
lot
of
sense.
illogical result you have when you don't believe what Joseph Smith said. So, But anyway, so the title page, last leaf of the plates, from the abridgment that he got, of the abridged plates, I call them, that were in the stone box.
Yeah.
He took those to Harmony. When he did the 116 pages, lost those, Oliver shows up. They translate all the way to the title page. And then he translated the title page, and they went and got it printed and did the copyright application. That was in June, early to mid-June, while he still hadn't finished the translation of the plates of Nephi. So right there, I'm kind of thinking, well, how does that work? Why would he be finished the last leaf of the plates, and now he's translating something else, you know? And then I realized, well, right there in D&C 9, the Lord said, finish this work, which was the plates he got from the stone box, the bridge plates. And then I have other records for you to translate. And you wonder, well, what were the other records? Right in D&C 10, it tells you the plates of Nephi. So he didn't have the plates of Nephi in Harmony, is the point. When he left, before he left Harmony, he was concerned about the plates. And the Lord told him to give them to this divine messenger, which he did. And then on the way to Fayette from Harmony, when David Whitmer came and picked him up, they met this guy on the side of the road, right? You know that story?
No, who records it? Where is
David
this
Whitmer
story?
talked about it several times.
He talks about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he said, we were riding along, and there was a guy on the side of the road, and Joseph told me to ask him if he'd like a ride. So they stopped and talked to the guy, and the guy says, yeah, it's really hot out. And David Whitmer said, do you want to ride to Fayette? And the guy says, no, I'm going to Cumorah. And David Whitmer, in his account of this, said, I didn't know what Cumorah meant. Of course, he hadn't read the Book of Mormon, right? At that point, it was still in the manuscript. And so he turned to Joseph and said, who was this guy? And Joseph said it was one of the 3 Nephites, and he had the plates. And so this account used to be in the Seminary and Institute manuals when I was growing up.
Really?
Yeah.
I've never heard this before.
Yeah.
Have you, Jackson?
I have, but
Other than because we heard it from Jonathan, right?
Yeah.
Had you heard it before?
yeah, I have.
I have my
really?
old manual where it's right in there,
Interesting.
And so I thought, when I read that, with the questions I had about the title page and so on, I thought, why would this guy be going to Cumorah? And then it dawned on me, well, wait a minute, because he had the abridged plates, and the Lord told Joseph Smith he had to translate the plates of Nephi, which he didn't have. So the messenger had to go back to the repository in Cumorah, drop off the abridged plates, pick up the plates of Nephi, and take those to Fayette. And that's why Joseph translated the plates of Nephi in Fayette. And there's lots of other aspects of this that make sense, but that's the overview.
That's crazy.
And so the other part of this that just continues to amaze me is when David Whitmer asked Joseph who the guy was, he said he was one of the 3 Nephites, right? When he got to Fayette, this messenger showed the plates to Mary Whitmer. And Mary Whitmer, who's David's mother, Mary Whitmer said he identified himself as Brother Nephi, which fits because we know among the 12 disciples in the Book of Mormon, one of them was named Nephi, and he was like the head.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that he would be one of the 3 who wanted to remain, right? It doesn't explicitly say that, but it makes sense. At least it's consistent.
Yeah.
So that was the narrative. And David Whitmer had a conversation with this guy and described him. He said he was older. He was about 5'8". He had a big, heavy beard. He was wearing a brown wool coat, and he said his beard wasn't as thick as Orson Pratt's or something like that.
Yeah.
But a big, heavy beard.
Beards.
Looked about 70, something like that. But he also had a separate conversation with Moroni about a month later, right, as one of the 3 witnesses. And he said, Moroni told me that to remain faithful, or whatever he said. So he had a conversation with the 2 different ones, and he knew they were 2 different people. So how do we get up with the story that it was Moroni that showed the plates to Mary Whitmer? You've all read that in the Saints book, right? It's just a completely fictitious story, because there's a guy named Andrew Jensen who compiled the history of the church, and when he got to this point of the messenger showing the plates to Mary Whitmer, he said, well, she said, or her grandson, I guess, said he identified himself as Brother Nephi, but Andrew Jensen said she must have been mistaken because it was Moroni who had charge of the plates. And that's where this whole thing started.
Okay, so Mary Whitmer did have an experience, but it wasn't with Moroni.
No, it was with one of the 3 Nephites.
Okay.
And now it's become this thing where everybody says that I'm terrible because I stick with the historical record, and I point out Andrew Jensen changed the narrative.
Yeah.
But the Saints book says it's Moroni, so therefore I must be wrong, you know. And all I say is, hey, just read the historical references. Don't read the Saints book.
Yeah.
And so, plus it makes sense if you think about it doctrinally.
Or read the Saints book, but look at the footnotes and check them out.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Okay. Fair.
Okay.
That's. I do say that. I like the Saints book. I just and even the footnotes are incomplete.
It's a good place for people to dip their toe in and to start a journey, but it shouldn't be the end of the journey.
Shouldn't be the end, and they should revise it. I've been advocating for them to revise it. I could tell you more about the background. We don't need to get into that. But the point is that they should be revised, and until it's revised, people need to learn for themselves that there's some false stuff in there. Plus, it teaches the doctrine that a resurrected being...
Or some one-sided stuff. Maybe it's not false, because it's not false that someone said that someone changed it. They just picked that historical account to use the revised one, then not. So it's not false. It's just they put their assumptions... Their hypothesis was that Jensen was correct in revising it. Right. So they weren't putting a lie in there.
Well, but they did, though, because they created a false dialogue in there. They said that when he appeared, he identified himself as Moroni, and that there's no account of that. It's just Andrew Jensen's editorial.
I know, but if you're, they're writing a narrative, right?
Yeah.
So they're writing the narrative that he appeared. Now you think that he appeared and identified himself as Nephi, based on these accounts. They, for whatever reasons, have decided that they think the other account is more legit, and so they went with that one. So they're not lying; they've just picked a different one, and they didn't share the other, right?
Yeah, you could say it that way. That's a nice way to say
it.
Okay. So I'm with you on that.
Yeah,
but the reality is,
I want there to be no contention.
That's right, no contention. Multiple working hypotheses.
So it's not charity and clarity. We got to put that charity in there. I was just putting a little charity.
I like the charity. Okay. I wish there was clarity.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's good.
If there was clarity, we wouldn't need to worry about the charity.
Yeah.
So anyway, but so that's the narrative of the two sets of plates. And what's interesting about it is too, along these lines, is in the Joseph Smith history, he says he returned the plates by prior arrangement to the messenger, right? We've all read that. Brigham Young said he returned the plates to Hill Cumorah. So there's a discrepancy there. And
unless the messenger is at the Hill Cumorah, then it's both.
Yeah, but he wasn't, because he said he returned the plates in harmony to the messenger.
Oh, in harmony. Okay.
And so he returned the plates of Nephi to the Hill Cumorah. So Brigham Young and Joseph Smith were both accurate. They were talking about two different sets of plates. And Lucy Mack Smith even said that he received the plates to show to the 8 witnesses from the messenger, which he didn't. The bridge plates he got from the stone box. He didn't receive them from the messenger. But the plates of Nephi he did receive from the messenger, and those are the ones that the 8 witnesses saw, apparently, because they said that they handled the plates, and none of them said there was a sealed portion. Right?
Interesting.
So there's a lot more detail, but that's the
were those made out of gold? The small plates were made out of gold as
well.
Yeah,
presumably, or an alloy, or
the appearance of gold. Right?
Appearance of gold. Yeah, Tumbaga, or gold-plated copper, or
whatever.
I know some other ancient plates that were made out of copper originally, and then plated with gold. So that's another possibility.
That's awesome.
That'd be a fun. I wish we could talk about that one sometime.
I know. Well, this has been an awesome discussion. I've really appreciated it. Thank you so much for coming out. Where's the best place for people to get the Rational Restoration?
Well, you can get on Amazon, Kindle, hardback. The publisher is Digital Legend. They have it on their website. Cool. Desert Book, wherever.
Yeah, actually, if you get it on Digital Legend, you can get 15% off if you use the code The Stick of Joseph. So if you want to get any of his books, use that. Get 15% off, and you can dive in and check out Mr. Neville's arguments for yourself. And so we appreciate it.
Before we end, I just can't stop thinking. As soon as you brought up that homie was one of the 3 Nephites.
Yeah.
Do you think that Brother Nephi watches our videos?
Wait.
I bet he's
You think one of the 3 Nephites watches our videos?
In what capacity are they roaming this earth and interacting with technology?
Do they have iPhones?
Dude,
that's a good question.
I'm just thinking of him looking at his phone right now, cracking his smile. He's like, they're on to me, bro.
Yeah.
Dude, leave a comment below if you're the 3rd Nephite. Make a new account if you need to.
After it,
if you need to be more anonymous,
and tell us the name of the other 2, because we're dying to know all 3 of your names.
I know.
You can stay anonymous, but just snitch out your other your other buddies. Yeah, I'm probably talking way too loud about this, but
Seriously.
you know.
Well, thank you 3 Nephites for watching, and until next time, stay curious and hungry.